welcome to our Anatomy and Physiology series. This is the first lecture in that series where we're going to study the organization of the human body. We're going to talk about the definition of anatomy and physiology, and then study how the human body is actually put together, going all the way from the molecular and microscopic, all the way to the organs and organ tissues that make up the body, and perhaps most importantly, how do those organ systems work together to maintain balance in the body, better known as homeostasis. After that, we're going to go over the terminology associated in any anatomy and physiology course. And it'll be really important that you study and learn these terms because we're going to use them constantly throughout the entire course. And if you go into a medical field, you'll be using these on a daily basis. So let's get started and let's learn about the human body. So let's first define what we mean by anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is the study of structure. And literally it means to cut open. So any anatomist is going to be studying the structure of things, whether it's the structure of the tissues that make up an organ, the organ itself, a limb, or the torso. And when you think of an anatomist, you often think of somebody dissecting something. And so most anatomy and physiology courses, if you're taking it face-to-face or through a kit that you get online, you're probably going to dissect something. Maybe it's a human cadaver or a model organism such as a fetal pig or a cat. Nowadays, they have some amazing virtual software where you can take MRI photographs of a cadaver and use your mouse or your trackpad to actually dissect down through the layers and identify the different structures. So lots of ways to cut things open and lots of ways to study the human body in an anatomy class. So now let's define what we mean by physiology. So physiology is the study of biological functions. So how do the structures actually work? What happens with them? How do different structures interact with each other? So this includes cells. So for example, how do cells secrete things, or how do other molecules attach to the surfaces of those cells? Studying how different tissues work and how the organs work. So maybe things like how blood travels through something or how an impulse travels through a neurological organ such as the brain. And the emphasis is on the actual mechanisms. And they've discovered these mechanisms through the scientific method, which you've probably learned about, doing experiments. And one of the things that's become perfectly clear is that function follows structure. So things only work a certain way because the things are built a certain way. So function follows structure. But those two concepts of structure, the anatomy, and physiology, the function, are intimately connected. That's why we call this course anatomy and physiology, because you can't have one without the other. So this idea is called the principle of complementarity of structure and function. The idea that structure and function, anatomy and physiology, can't be separated. They go together. So now let's talk about how the body is actually put together. So we're really the sum of a whole lot of parts. There may be trillions and trillions and trillions of cells making us up, but those cells themselves are composed of little compartments, and those cells work together to make larger structures, which work together to make larger structures, and so on until you have the complete organism. So at the smallest level, we're talking about atoms and their subatomic particles. So atoms are elements of the periodic table. And to date, at the time of this recording, I believe we have discovered a total of 118 elements of the periodic table, 92 of which are natural. Well, these atoms are going to come together through chemical processes to make larger structures called molecules. And those molecules will then come together, and in our bodies, they create cells which work together to make tissues. So if you want to get down to why certain diseases happen or what the cures for those diseases are, it's really critical to understand what's happening at the molecular level, the cellular level. And oftentimes we'll find that there were problems with the DNA itself, the genetic material that tells the cell what to do. Or maybe there were structural problems at the cellular level. Maybe there was a missing receptor on the membrane, or things weren't moving around properly. So it's really important that even in an anatomy class, we really pay attention to what happens at that cellular level. So when those cells work together to make a larger structure. We call those tissues. And we're going to be studying tissues extensively in this class. And when you study tissues with a microscope, that's a field called histology. So we're going to be studying everything from epithelial tissue, which includes things like the coverings of organs and inside your cheek and that kind of stuff, skin, to connective tissues that hold things together. And that includes even liquid fluid tissues like blood. So we're going to be studying that extensively because those tissues work together to create organs. So you see a stomach here, and that's an example of an organ made up of different kinds of tissues. And so obviously in anatomy and physiology, we're going to study those organs, but more importantly, we're going to study how those organs work together at the systemic point, how they work together in systems. And it's these organs working together at the systems level. So for example, liver, stomach, intestine, all working together. Eventually they come together to make the organism. So we're going to, in the anatomy and physiology, study everything from the atom to the organism. So as you just saw, we're going to study things from going from the atom to the organism. And that entails that we have to have two kinds of anatomy, two levels of anatomy. The microscopic level, which entails using a microscope. And again, that, as I mentioned, is called histology. That's where we study the actual tissues. So for example, here's a tissue, here's some tissue, here's some tissue. And so anything where you're dealing with the microscopic level is a branch of anatomy and physiology called histology. When you're looking at the macroscopic structures, the big structures such as your arm or your leg, a heart or a muscle or an organ, this is called gross anatomy. So we're going to be doing both in this course, microscopic and gross anatomy. So in our anatomy and physiology series, we're going to be studying 11 different organ systems. But organ systems, of course, are groups of organs with related functions. And you can kind of see some of them laid out here. This chart goes over those 11 systems. So we're going to study the integumentary system, which includes your skin, hair, nails, and it has a protective and thermoregulatory function. So it helps to cool the body down or heat it up, depending on what it needs. And it's your first line of defense. So if a bacterial cell or a virus comes in from the outside, it's going to have to get through your skin, your integumentary system, to be able to invade the body. We're going to be studying the nervous system, which is the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And these, of course, have a regulatory function. They regulate the other body systems. So the brain, of course, is the boss of the body. We're going to be eventually studying the endocrine system, which is responsible for your hormones. So your hormones regulate all sorts of things in the body. So there's often glands that will secrete these hormones. So some of these, like for example, the pituitary is found in the brain, thyroid, adrenal glands. And the hormones that they secrete are really the communication mechanism of the body. So those hormones get released to all the cells of the body, some of which will respond and some of which will not respond. But by releasing those hormones, it helps to maintain that balance, that homeostasis in the body. And of course, you can't have an anatomy and physiology class without studying the skeletal and muscular systems. So the skeleton, of course, is your bones and your cartilage. It's responsible for allowing your body to move and provides the support it needs to function. The muscular system has different kinds of muscles in there. So your skeletal muscles are the muscles that are under your control. We can, choose to flex our muscle or move it however we want. There's also muscles that are not voluntary. So your smooth muscle and your cardiac muscle, we'll be studying all those. But, these have obviously the function of movement, whether it's to move your entire body or a limb, or to move things like blood or other things through the body. Circulatory system is your heart, your blood vessels, and your lymphatic vessels. And these are to move other things through the body, blood, lymph, things like that. So your heart, of course, would be part of your circulatory system. The immune system is where you're going to produce cells that help with the immune response. So bone marrow, lymphoid organs. It's all about defense, right? Defense against invading pathogens. And then we have our respiratory system, which is your lungs and the things connected to your lungs, like your trachea. And this, of course, is for gas exchange, exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide with the environment. So the urinary system includes your kidneys, your ureters, your urethra, bladder. So these are parts of the body that will help to regulate the blood, make sure your salt content and your potassium content are in balance and other things. So we'll spend some time on that. Digestive system is your mouth, stomach, intestine, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, basically anything that's part of a single tube that's been folded up to help move food and nutrients through the system. So breakdown of food into molecules that enter the body. And finally, the reproductive system. This is obviously the system that has the organs that are needed to reproduce humans. And so it includes your gonads, which is testicles for males or ovaries for females, the external genitalia, any other associated glands and ducts. But this ultimately, you can't have humans without the reproductive system. So here we're just looking at those 11 systems. So kind of from a pictorial view here. So you can see the cardiovascular system with all the blood vessels and the heart going through there, the urinary system, the muscular system, respiratory system with the lungs and the trachea and the mouth, nervous system, endocrine system with all the endocrine glands, your lymphatic system with all the lymphatic ducts, digestive system, reproductive system, skeletal system, and integumentary system. Now, how are you going to keep track of all those? Well, there's a little study trick. Run Mrs. Leideck. So R could be respiratory or reproductive, U for urinary, N for nervous, M for muscle. There's your other R. So again, either respiratory or reproductive, whichever one you didn't use before. Skeletal, lymphatic, integumentary, digestive, endocrine, and cardiovascular. So one of the things you'll find in an anatomy and physiology class is we use a lot of mnemonic devices to help remember all sorts of things. So ultimately, all these organ systems work together in order to maintain life. That's the goal, to make sure we're alive. So what are some of the things we need to be alive? Let's take a look at them. So number one, maintaining boundaries. So one of the things you'll find as you study anatomy and physiology is there's all sorts of compartments. Things are very compartmentalized. And that's so that you can keep the functions happening in one area separate from the functions happening in another area. So for example, you'll find that our skin is the boundary between the external environment and our internal environment. Your heart lies in a cavity and has membranes that help keep it separate from the pleural area, the lung area that's going on around it. And this, I could give example after example, but that is definitely one of the things we need to maintain our life, is to keep that separation. Movement. We need to be able to move, not just on a macroscopic level, but also on a microscopic level. So on the macroscopic level, we have to be able to move our skeletal muscles. We have to be able to move our legs, our arms, our head, our mouth, all that kind of stuff. Of course, we have movement in our cardiac region, i.e. our heart. So the heart has to pump in order to pump blood through it. And of course, we have smooth muscle that's found in all of our organs, inside our blood vessels, to keep liquids and nutrients moving the way they need to move. So stuff is moving, and that's one of the ways you know that you're alive. Responsiveness. So we have to be able to send signals throughout the body. Your body is like a communication highway. Stuff is always going in and out and in and out and in and out. We send signals from the brain down to the spinal cord through our nerves and therefore to our muscles so that we can actually respond. And those muscles send responses back. You have to be able to feel pain so that if something bad is happening that could cause problems, your body is going to be able to get that signal that something's wrong and respond to it. And then we also have responsiveness in terms of contractility, i.e. the movement at the cellular level. So we have to be able to have our cells move stuff in and out of their membranes, across their membranes inside the cell to the outside of the cell and vice versa. And we need those cells to be able to respond to communication signals they receive, such as hormones or nerve impulses. And of course, we have to be able to digest things. So when you consume food or liquid, there's nutrients in there that your body needs. And in order to get those nutrients, it has to be able to break those particles down, or those clumps of food or whatever it is you ingested. It has to be able to break those down into tiny, tiny fragments and eventually into little, very, very little particles that can move across cell membranes. Ultimately, what we have to do is feed our cells, give our cells the nutrients and minerals that they need, and it can't do that unless we have a digestive process to break that down. Metabolism. So we have to be able to do something with those nutrients that we just digested. And that's where all the chemical reactions of our body come in. And that's called metabolism. So we're going to be talking a lot about different metabolic reactions that happen in the body. What are the starting points? What are the ending points? And what has to mediate that process? Now, in doing all that metabolism, we produce a lot of waste, a lot of toxic things or things we just don't need in the body. Maybe there's excess of it. And in order to have our body be healthy, we have to be able to excrete that extra stuff that we don't want. And we're going to do that through the process of excretion, which, for example, urination and defecation. Reproduction, if you don't reproduce, it doesn't go on. So we have to have reproduction in order to maintain life in the long run. And that's going to happen through our reproductive organs and functions that we are going to talk about later in anatomy and physiology. And finally, growth. So you are born very small. And in fact, you started life as just a single fertilized cell. And that was a microscopic cell. And so through the process of mitosis and meiosis, that cell has been replicating parts of it. So through the process of mitosis, a cell divides, and then each of those cells divide, and each of those cells divide, forming tissues and organ systems. And that process continues certainly through your youth until you stop growing. But even after that, cells continue to grow. So throughout life, you have to have that growth of cells and that replication of cells. And so you can't have life if you don't grow. Let's talk about homeostasis. So everything we study about the human body really revolves around homeostasis. That is trying to keep that balance in the body. So the body really is like a balancing act. It's like a seesaw, if things are too high, we got to bring it down. If things are too low, we got to bring it down. Or in some cases, we got to even make more of it. So let's talk about homeostasis and the way our body maintains balance, because this really forms the nuts and bolts, the basis of everything we're going to study in this class. So we can define homeostasis as the constancy of the internal environment. In other words, our bodies are constantly trying to maintain that balance, but they really never get there for very long. Our bodies are having to work so hard. So we started life as a single cell, or if you want to go before that, a sperm and an egg. And this cell consists of organelles, and stuff's constantly moving in and out. And in order to keep things the way they're supposed to be, that cell has to work really hard. It needs energy to try to maintain things at the proper amounts in the proper ways that they're supposed to be. So we're constantly, from the time we're created until the time we're dead, we are constantly undergoing many mechanisms of homeostasis. And the reason for this is because anytime we deviate too much from homeostasis, it causes disease. So you really can think of disease as being a breach from a homeostatic situation. So what kinds of homeostasis does our bodies work towards? Well, all sorts of things. So you can see in this diagram, it just lists some of the kinds of balancing acts that our body has to do. So, whether it's baroregulation, hormonal regulation, making sure our hormones are in the proper amounts. The pH, if you deviate, for example, too far from the 7.4 pH in our blood, you could go into a coma or die. Et cetera, et cetera. So even psychological or psychosocial regulation, everything. Our bodies are constantly trying to maintain the right amounts of everything. And so all these different things we're looking at here that our bodies try to maintain homeostatic control over, pH, blood sugar, temperature, et cetera, these are called variables. So they're things that can change. Factors that can change are the variables in our body. And homeostatic control, to control those variables, is going to involve three things: a receptor, a control center, and an effector. So let's take a deeper look at these three things that are under homeostatic control. So this diagram kind of puts in perspective, in general, how homeostatic control works. Then we're going to take it down into the actual feedback mechanisms that are involved in this and some actual empirical examples in the body. So we said homeostasis is like a seesaw. It's like a balancing act. You know, if you've ever been on a seesaw as a kid, when, you know, one kid is up here, the other one's down here, and then it goes back and forth like this, right? So that's a seesaw. That's trying to maintain balance. If the two kids are exactly the same weight, then it might stay in balance. So it's all about balance and imbalance. So what kicks in a homeostatic control process is some sort of stimulus. So that stimulus is the change in the variable that we are dealing with. So if this is temperature, when your body detects a change in that temperature, that's going to be a stimulus that's going to kick off the whole event. So first thing that happens is a stimulus. So in the example of the seesaw, there's an imbalance. Maybe, you know, the kid down here weighs more than the kid up here. So the seesaw is out of balance. It's an imbalance. That's a stimulus. And what's going to happen with that stimulus depends on the presence of a receptor to detect that imbalance. Now, in a seesaw, that receptor might be an angry kid. But in our bodies, that receptor is usually an actual protein structure on the surface of the cell, on the cell membrane. So those are called cellular receptors. And that receptor is going to detect the change, and that is going to cause it to give input into a control center. So input is whatever information that receptor is going to send to the control center that says, hey, we got a problem. We're out of balance here. Now, that control center might be the brain. That's usually the case. So usually there are cells in the brain that will pick up that input signal from the receptor and cause a change to happen. But it could be other things. It could be like endocrine glands, for example, if you're dealing with hormones. So this idea of going from the stimulus through the receptor to the control center is what's called the afferent pathway. So afferent refers to, you know, sending something away to a control center. So that's the afferent pathway. Once it's in the control center, for example, the brain, cells in the brain are going to say, I'm interpreting this as something's wrong and we need to fix it. And so it's going to fix it by sending out information through the efferent pathway with an E. That output is information that's going to tell the receiver, okay, here's what you need to do to fix this. So the receiver is called the effector. So the effector might be a muscle, for example, a muscle cell. That muscle cell is going to receive the nerve impulse from the control center and cause something to happen, like a muscle contraction, for example. So in this case, if I was talking about a muscle contraction, that would be called the response. So the effector elicits a response that then causes a change to the stimulus. In other words, going towards returning that stimulus back to the balance, back to the original level. So, you know, stimulus, there's a change. That change is detected by the receptor. Receptor says, I need to send this up to the boss for interpretation. So that would be the control center, such as the brain or an endocrine gland. That control center interprets the message, decides that something needs to be done, and sends information through the efferent pathway to the effector. The effector sends the response and to return things back to normal. So that's the general big picture of homeostatic control works. But I think the most easy way to understand this is through some examples. So let's first talk about the most common method of homeostatic control, and that is the negative feedback loop, or sometimes called negative feedback mechanisms. So in negative feedback mechanisms, it's kind of like just what we saw there, that, you know, something changes, a message is sent saying something's wrong, interpretation is, okay, it's wrong, let's fix it, and a change happens that kind of sends it back to where it's supposed to be. But this is a good way to think about this is the thermostat in your house. So the thermostat would be like the control center, like your brain, right? It's going to make an interpretation and cause an output response to happen. So if the thermostat is set to 71 and the house gets cold, then the thermometer inside of the thermostat is going to be the receptor to say, you know, this is not it's not going to interpret it, but it's going to say this is not 71, it's cold. It's going to send the message to the thermostat, the brain. Brain's going to say, it's not at 71. This is a problem. I'm going to send a message to the heater to turn on to bring the temperature back up. And so it does. Once the response kicks in, the heater kicks in, it brings the temperature back up. Then the receptor is going to say, the thermometer is going to say, okay, now it's at 71. Send that message to the control center. Control center is saying, we're good. Okay, heater, shut off, right? So that's a negative feedback mechanism. And if it goes the other way, if the house gets too hot, then the receptor is going to say, the thermometer is going to say it's too hot. It's going to send the message to the control center, the thermostat. The thermostat's going to say, okay, we need to bring it down. Okay, air conditioner kick in, and it's going to bring it back down. So that's a negative feedback loop. The idea is that it reduces or shuts off that original stimulus. So we're going to study a ton of negative feedback loops in anatomy and physiology. Pretty much most of the things that happen in our body are negative feedback loops. So in our body, a good example of that is temperature in our body. So let's say that, our normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 Fahrenheit. We like to use 37 Celsius in science. So it's supposed to be 37 Celsius. That's where our thermostat inside our body is set. If the temperature gets too hot, then the body's going to say, no, you're not supposed to be that hot. And so the brain is going to send signals to our skin to produce sweat, and we're going to sweat to cool things down. So that causes the body temperature to drop. But as the body temperature drops too much, it's going to send a signal to the brain saying, okay, now we've gone below 37 Celsius. So it's going to send messages back to our muscle cells that are going to cause the muscles to shake and shimmy. And that shivering is going to generate heat, which is going to bring our body temperature back towards 37. And again, if temperature goes too far above 37, brain says, okay, kick back in the sweat glands and bring it back down. So it's just, our body is constantly doing this kind of thing. Same thing with testing your blood glucose level. So if your blood sugar level goes too high, mechanisms will be kicked in to bring that blood sugar back down. If it gets too low, that's a problem. That's going to cause dizziness and weakness as well. So it's going to send signals to bring that blood sugar back up. So constantly, we're going to maintain this homeostasis. Now, most things in our body follow negative feedback loops, but there are a few examples of positive feedback loops. And what's interesting is ultimately it still goes back to negative feedback loops, because once a positive feedback loop has done what it needs to do, a negative feedback loop will kick in to stop the positive feedback loop. But basically, whereas the purpose of the negative feedback loop was to reduce or stop a stimulus, it's the opposite in a positive feedback loop. In a positive feedback loop, it amplifies a stimulus. So it makes it more intense, and oftentimes it speeds it up. And so that'll keep happening until the negative feedback loop kicks in. So there's some interesting examples of this. One is blood clotting. So if you get a scratch, like I don't know if you guys can see this, but I have a scratch from my cat on my hand. When that scratch happens and you start bleeding, you need to be able to clot your blood to stop the bleeding. Otherwise you could bleed out. So you're going to suddenly get the kick in of a positive feedback loop for blood clotting. So let's say here's the blood vessel. My cat scratched me and out comes the blood. We're going to immediately need to start clotting. And so a signal is going to be initiated to platelets in the blood. And platelets themselves, these are these little tiny components of the blood, and they release chemicals when they're activated. So once they receive that message as a result of the cut that you got, the tear of the blood vessel, those platelets are going to start releasing chemicals that are communication mechanisms to other platelets saying, okay, we got a problem, everybody come together and recruit some more. And so those platelets are going to start sticking to each other, and they're also going to release chemicals that recruit other platelets to come stick together as well. Well, the more that are activated by the chemicals, the more will release chemicals. And so you start getting this cascade where the more clotting you have, the more clotting you're going to get. And so that keeps going. And so these platelets are clumping up and stopping the bleeding at the cut. And that only ends when the tear is healed in the blood vessel. So those guys have clotted up and repaired the damage to the blood vessel. And that at that point, once the clotting has happened sufficiently, a signal is going to happen that is going to stop that recruitment process. It's going to stop the chemical release from these platelets. So ultimately, the stoppage of it is where the negative feedback mechanism comes in, but the formation of the clot is a positive feedback mechanism. Other examples of this, childbirth. So when a woman's in labor, the kicking in of the labor will result in an increase in oxytocin, which causes more contractions and more labor, and which causes more oxytocin, which causes more labor. And that keeps going on. And the end to it is when the baby is actually born. That will kick in the negative feedback mechanism. Same thing for lactation. The more the baby drinks the milk, the more milk that will be produced, which causes more drinking, which causes more milk, etc., until you wean the baby. So those are some examples of positive feedback loops.